Next, Bill Minutaglio tells the story of an explosion and fire in 1947 that killed hundreds of people in Texas City. The source of the explosion was a plant where ammonium nitrate was being converted for use as fertilizer by war-torn European countries. This is a little under an hour and a half.
Thank you very much for coming out on a cold Austin night. Very, very generous of you to come spend some time with me. I'm guessing, even before I begin, that there are a lot of people here tonight who know more about the Texas City disaster than I do, and I'm looking forward to hearing your stories. And I bet a lot of the folks here will find their stories maybe more fascinating than what I wrote in this book. Let me just read a little bit and hopefully set the table for what the story is about. I'm going to start reading a little bit into the book about a Catholic priest who's central to my story. He's one of the heroes of the book. And in the weeks building up to the Texas City disaster in 1947, this very courageous, brave priest who I think really defined the word populist, and he was trying to correct some wrongs in Texas City, began having very unsettling visions, very prophetic visions. And to his closest friends, it was very eerie, very ominous. His family members couldn't really understand what was happening to him. And he was literally wasting away before people's eyes. And all of this kind of builds up to a moment in April, on a very, very beautiful day, a very beautiful spring day in April in '47. The premonitions have reached such a point that the priest knows that something's going to happen this day and maybe even the next few minutes. I'll just begin here. It's 8:45 a.m. As he runs, he passes Longshoreman Kerry Johnson, briskly walking in the other direction. Johnson stares at Roach and thinks that he's a good man, about the only damned white man you could seriously trust in Texas City. In a way that he hadn't ever talked with anyone about, Johnson had come to love Father Roach. The priest has passed Johnson now, scrambling onto the wharf, feeling the walls of heat, and aiming for a well-dressed man who is staring into the ceaseless banks of smoke, heaving from deep inside the superheated freighter. There are men screaming something from the gunmetal gray deck railings of the Grand Comp, their words being swallowed by the roaring, painful cracking noises ricocheting deep inside the ship's holds. Father Roach watches as the ship's deck suddenly swells. It rises like a pregnant mass covered by hissing wood and hot steel. The water in the bay is beginning to churn, frothing as if it is being beaten. Roach bolts to Mike McKeska's side, and for a second, the most important person in Texas City, the man who runs the company and the waterfront, pulls his attention from the spreading commotion, the cresting noise, and the urgent voices on the pier. Dozens of firemen are racing into the smoke. 6 firemen are futilely wrestling with a hose. It looks as if they are spraying steam instead of water. The inferno blasts are so intense that as the water roars out of the hose, it is instantly vaporized. McKeska turns and stares at the wild-eyed priest. Now tarpaulins of smoke are speeding and flooding across the 60-foot wide deck of the big ship. Pooling in corners, they spin into thick masses and soar straight into the sky. There is a nauseating chemical stench. Sailors are yelling in French and disappearing amid the billows. Frantic longshoremen suddenly come shoving out of a north-facing wall of black haze. Now there are 28 firemen facing the ship, all of them desperately trying to unroll the hoses. They inch toward the huge, rattling freighter, while dozens of sailors and dock workers scramble down ropes and gangplanks and flee in the opposite direction. On the rim of the docks, the wide-eyed children in the crowd of 500 onlookers are hurrahing and clapping with each new commotion, with each new cloud that rockets up, spreads out over the bay like a painting by Matisse, and then zooms to the Gulf of Mexico. It is the most vivid, beautiful thing they have ever seen. Over his shoulder, just after 9 a.m., Kerry Johnson can hear Father Roach screaming. Roach's voice is rising out of the babel. Roach wonders if McKeska can even hear him, whether McKeska wants to hear him. Overhead, 2 airplanes are banking and turning into the deepest part of the chemical fog. Roach is still shouting, "Move that damn ship." Father William Francis Roach had always felt that wildly, wickedly disparate things and people improbably converged on Texas City. Drag that ship into the bay right now. Move the ship into open water. Roach, like the hundreds of people who have crowded near the vessel, can hardly see. The 7,200-ton ship looks as if it's gasping for breath. The deck planks are bending horribly, and long rusted nails are shooting straight up into the air. Suddenly, there is a long, fast series of sharp, cracking noises, like machine gun blasts, coming from below decks. Roach is begging, please move the damn ship. He can see that the Gulf of Mexico is bubbling, and it is as it is something from his delirious dreams. The sea is now boiling. This is going to story interrupt us. I'll leave you right there. But the one thing that I learned about Texas City, and I think there's a lot of debate about what happened there, what some people call the greatest industrial disaster in the most industrialized nation in the history of mankind. One thing that I think a lot of people will agree upon is that it took a lot of trains moving from different stations to converge for this event to occur. Looking back at what happened at 9/11 that day, and a lot of stories written about how if the weather had been a little bit different, just many millions of little things have been different. Maybe 9/11, as we know it, wouldn't have occurred. The same rules apply in Texas City. What makes this story, I think, a little bit different is that, in my estimation, this is the least known and least appreciated, in one sense of the word, disaster in American history. An enormous loss of life, somewhere around 600 confirmed, the possibility of being many more dead, as many as 5,000 injured. In today's dollars, around $4.5 billion in damage. An entire fire department wiped off the face of the earth. And in fact, the greatest American fire department tragedy prior to 9/11. Just incredibly significant amount of ripple effect from this story. And I began to wonder, and I'm sure somebody will ask later why I began writing this story, but let me skip ahead. When I was into the story, I began wondering with amazement why we hadn't heard more about the Texas City disaster, why it wasn't honored, appreciated, studied. And I think I came upon a twofold answer. It had something to do with first and foremost, the people who live in Texas City, who lived there then and live there now. Extraordinary, hardworking folks who really put their shoulder to the wheel and in a very quiet, anonymous ways. People who have very little time for melancholy. They wake up in the morning, go to work, and do really hard work. If any of you have been to Texas City, and again, I'm guessing that some of you have been or are from there, it's essentially a factory town. It's a refinery-driven community and dominated by the petrochemical and the energy industry. You set aside any feelings you have about what that means, politically speaking, environmentally speaking. At the very bottom line level, it means hard work and dangerous work. And in Texas City, I found over and over again, very curiously, I thought initially people would come to me and say, why are you writing this story? It's either not that important or we just don't want the attention. We don't want to draw attention to ourselves. And I went ahead and wrote the book. I beg to differ. And hopefully I came to the story, and you'll be the judge, with some measure of, ever ongoing respect for the fact that people not only confronted an apocalyptic moment on Earth, but then lived in a way to almost honor it by not drawing attention to it, if that makes sense, almost aggressively so. Sort of a pre-media age. CNN wasn't there, cameras weren't present, and people didn't seek that out, nor do they do today. So a lot of forms of courage and bravery were exhibited in Texas City, and when the dust settled, that was certainly one aspect of bravery. Something else that really occurred to me as I was wrapping up the book and working with my wonderful research team. I see one there, Mike Smith. Raise your hand, Mike, would you, if you don't mind? And if Jordan's here, I don't know if she's here as well, Jordan Smith, but Mike and Jordan Smith, to veer off the track a little bit, are among the finest researchers in America. Had the benefit of working with them in a biography that I did of President Bush, and neither of these books would have been done without their expert work. So, thanks. One thing that emerged real quickly as we were working on this book together, 9/11 occurred, and it set in motion some very specific things that happened to me that are probably less interesting than I think that the bigger picture parallels. Insider baseball. My editors took a look at what had happened and said, "My gosh, you've written a story about a disaster that occurred in 1947. Will anybody even care anymore?" And I said to them what I think is true, that the same lessons in human courage and bravery, those manifest instances when people reach deep inside of themselves when confronted with something awful, those kind of universal tales that we look for in human nature were there in Texas City, and they were hidden and they were quiet, and therefore always and forever deserve to be remembered. So I differed a little bit with my publishers and editors about the worth of this story in some way. The editors and publishers believed in the book, but I think they blinked a little bit, if I may say so. But then we rolled forward and continued the book. The parallels were extraordinary. There were two planes that struck the World Trade Center. There were two planes, shot out of the sky over Texas City that awful day. There were initial thoughts that terrorists had invaded the United States or had launched an attack and were attacking kind of the industrial underbelly of the United States in this vulnerable place. The very essence of the story revolves around a magical, a brilliant, and an awful compound called ammonium nitrate. And that too has a parallel to 9/11. In the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, terrorists employed ammonium nitrate to try to topple the World Trade Center in 93. Ammonium nitrate is what blew up in Texas City and devastated the town and changed things forever for thousands and thousands of people, not only in Texas City, but across America. Ammonium nitrate was used by Timothy McVeigh. It's probably where it's most commonly known. Used by Timothy McVeigh in his horrible attack on the federal building in Oklahoma City. And remember, this is decades after people knew about the awful abilities of ammonium nitrate in 1947. Working on this book and this story, there was a danger of almost disappearing down a rabbit hole. There were just so many entry points and exit points for the story, and fortunately, with the help of good researchers, great researchers, we tried to keep the story focused. One of the things where I think I was most in danger, one of the areas where I was most in danger of disappearing forever into the writing cave was exploring ammonium nitrate. And I suppose I went into journalism for the reason a lot of journalists did. We weren't very good at math or science, so stuck to the word side of school and tried to learn what ammonium nitrate was. And most estimations are that it is just one of the most fabulous and brilliant chemical compounds to be perfected by man. At the turn of the dawn of the 20th century, scientists came to a very real belief that we on planet Earth were running out of food, that the population on planet Earth was just growing exponentially, and we wouldn't have the ability to feed ourselves. And a clarion call went out to the brilliant scientists of the day to retreat into the labs and come up with something, come up with a solution. And a brilliant Nobel Prize-winning German chemist came out of his lab announcing that he had essentially perfected and wanted to introduce a substance, a perfected version of ammonium nitrate that would be the greatest fertilizer in mankind's history. And with some debate and argument, you could actually suggest that that's true. People have told me, farmers have told me, throw the stuff on the ground and crops spring forth, later that day. It's an exaggeration, but it's good stuff. And millions of people around the world, as I say in the book, are addicted to it, in the sense that we wouldn't have crops growing in such great abundance without this chemical. That's the good side. There's a bad side. There's several bad sides to that, actually. The primary bad side is that ammonium nitrate, as it was being developed, had this Janus-like ability to bring great joy and great sorrow all at once. As he was developing it as a fertilizer, it was also being developed, virtually the same substance, being developed as an incredible explosive, something that could be used in the bomb-making plants during World War I and especially during World War II. And it was produced in great tonnage around the world for that latter use. The story, to me, I mentioned earlier my belief that there were a lot of trains that had to leave the station all around the world, in fact, to bring us to a spring morning in April in 1947 in a small town, 15,000 people on the coast of Texas. Geopolitical forces, such as they are, suggested that during World War II we needed a lot of ammonium nitrate for bombs, for making bombs. After World War II ended, the hot war ended, the Cold War began. In the White House, President Truman sent down orders, essentially, that we needed to reseed the fields of Europe and feed the bellies of Europeans and win their hearts and minds and keep them away from the sway, the tug of communism and the rising specter, if you will, of the Soviet Union. Texas City, which had helped to win the war by providing all the fuel and the petrochemicals that we would need to win the war, dominated by what some folks used to call Rosie the Riveters, a lot of hardworking women who worked in defense plants, and then repopulated after the war by veterans who had come back home after surviving enormous peril overseas, came to work in this boom town called Texas City to process, transport ammonium nitrate to begin winning that other war, the Cold War. The folks in Texas City, that I met, didn't dwell on this at that time. They, I don't think, sat around the refinery on their breaks and talked about the welling specter of communism or the dawning age of the Cold War. They had work to do. They had to punch the clock. They had to make sure their kids got to school. The town was so booming and overcrowded with people jockeying for these blue-collar refinery jobs that school was split into twin shifts. It was so crowded that they had to separate essentially the student body at a young age into two groups, the kids who came in the afternoon and the kids who came in the morning. A very important point in terms of convergence. It meant that on a beautiful spring morning, to repeat myself, there were a lot of children who weren't in school out of necessity because Texas City was so booming, because somewhere all the way up the chain in the White House, somebody had deemed it important to produce ammonium nitrate and win that war in Europe. You could, connect the dots in some way. It's like a series of dominoes, I suppose, that click and clack and fall over. Because of decisions made in the White House, children in some way weren't in school in Texas City. The president had ordered ammonium nitrate to be produced in massive quantities to help win that Cold War. It resulted in work in Texas City. It resulted in people moving to Texas City. It resulted in Texas City being so crowded that children were told, come to the afternoon session as opposed to the morning session. And children being children, I've got two of my own, saw something welling up, just like Father Roach had seen welling up on the waterfront that morning. So beautiful plumes of smoke, tangerine-colored smoke, unlike anything they had ever seen, even far beyond the qualities of a really good fireworks show, something really magnetic, and kids, almost like the Pied Piper, they began riding their bikes down, their little homemade scooters, holding hands, walking down to the waterfront, sometimes going with their parents. They wanted to see the fire, see the smoke. And again, I'm probably guilty as charged of connecting too many dots, but to me there really was a cause and effect. Giant geopolitical forces were whirling around, way above the cloud line, way outside the real realm of understanding and maybe even interest, frankly, again, because people are bone weary, they're working. They're not studying the nuances of posturing in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Yet what's happening there is like a train leaving a station, it's headed toward Texas City and a fatal moment. There have been a number of really great books written about Texas City, ones that no doubt are I'll sound sanctimonious and pious, or no doubt are better than this one. They do things better than I do in this book. Some are very academic and very scientific and help to really deconstruct, again, the science, the engineering of what happened, the physics of what happened with this explosion. There are some that are incredibly acutely personal to the point where they're told through the eyes of one person. What I wanted to do was a mixture of both of those, and much like those trains leaving the station, to keep extending my analogy here, is to find a number of individuals in Texas City who perhaps were emblematic of the city at large. And I'll tell you what, that was a really, really hard thing to do. I talked about this extensively, again, with my faithful and extremely talented research partners. So many people died, so many people were injured, so many people were left homeless, that at the outset of our story, or our investigation into the story, examination of the story, we had to, I suppose, leave people at the side of the road at that station again. Sorry. But that was a really tough task. We had to basically recreate people's lives and then perhaps decide at some point they weren't a central enough figure in the story to be emblematic of the story at large. That was an awful, awful decision. We just had to say some people would fit into what we want to do and some people wouldn't. It was as simple but as complex as that, and that was an awful, awful process that I think, I know lasted for months on end, and sitting alone, so many decades removed from this disaster and geographically removed, it was a pretty humbling process. At the end of the day, I think at least in some small fashion, we keyed in on some folks whom I think you had to write about to tell the Texas City story. The mayor of the city, who much, I guess, like Rudy Giuliani, became a heroic figure for some. He was at the heart of this story, and a really wonderful, amazing man who has a wonderful, amazing family, a very generous family. A guy who had returned home from World War II, only had a 12th grade education, but was probably one of the smartest people that I've ever met. He had been gravely injured in the Battle of the Bulge during World War II, and somehow or other, almost like a figure in an old Jimmy Stewart movie, he found himself the mayor of the small town. It almost seemed to happen by accident. And then, not too long after being mayor, he gets confronted with hell on earth, a nightmare of unbelievable proportions. And in a lot of ways, to me, much like hundreds and thousands of people there, he embodied the true rising and yes, positive element of this story. The most unlikely person, perhaps, the most quiet and ordinary and average American, found himself reaching down into a well of courage that even he didn't know was there, and behaving in extraordinary ways and helpful ways, kind ways, generous ways. And as the mayor of the town, he embodied what hundreds of people there did. It's a story that should almost be studied in a way for the way a community behaves, almost the sociology of it. I didn't really kind of tackle the story in that literal way, but I hope some of that comes across. We tried to look at what was going on in different portions of the community, different economic strata, different ages, and that was deliberate, just to give you a cross-section, but to show, at the end of the day, the uniformity. People, without knowing it, were moving in concert, and they were moving in concert to help each other. You know, when you're a journalist, as I've been for too long, you get very, very cynical. And the great joy of working on the story was that I could feel the cynicism peeling away, and it's something that yeah, I think affected me personally in some ways, and I knew that to be true because I actually dragged my daughter down to Texas City with me one day. I attended one of the annual memorial services that they have there in Texas City, which is an incredibly moving event that begins with the ringing of a bell by the fire chief in the town, and it kind of just peels out and kind of blossoms over the community in this flat stretch of land that kind of gives way to the Gulf of Mexico eventually, and Galveston Bay, and each tone is for another fallen fireman, and it just goes on forever, and it's sad. I felt good in some ways about the fact that I had taken my daughter down there. I don't know that, I can't honestly say she absorbed it all or understood why we were there, but I thought it just sort of important that by osmosis or just proximity to the folks there, to the people there, the survivors there, that she be in the presence of people who acted courageously and bravely and extra bravely, more bravely, because they did it anonymously. They did it in a time period when you know, it was this pre-media age, and the opportunity is to toot your horn and go in front of the camera and in some ways you know, draw attention to yourself. They just didn't exist. If they did, the people there wouldn't succumb to that anyway. So it was an amazing experience to work on it, even in terms of sort of a process of self-understanding, if I may say so. One thing that I just kind of came to that really jarred me, and it had a lot to do with 9/11 as well in terms of parallels, is the fact that, you know, during 9/11, I think, you know, we kind of got inured to the little thing that would scroll across the bottom of our screens when watching the evening news, and it would say, you know, 1,000 dead, and the number always seemed to rise, you know, and then identified dead. The presumption or the assumption being that there were unidentified dead, and as we know, of course, you know, there were countless people missing in 9/11. The same thing happened here. The number wasn't as high, but there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of missing people in Texas City, people who vanished from Earth, from their families, from their loved ones, in the blink of an eye. To honor those people, the citizens of Texas City decided that they would you know, build a memorial cemetery, and it's a very moving place. If you go there today, there are simple stone markers in a little patch of land to the north of the city, and they're just marked with numbers because we don't know who's buried there. And it's an incredibly powerful place just to, you know, walk and kind of recreate or remember. What I came to learn, and what some people there quietly shared with us, was the fact that in those graves, where the remains of the deceased, the unidentified remains, were laid to rest, it's a pretty good bet that in some of those caskets are laid to rest the remains of black, white, and Hispanic residents of the area. In other words, they're commingled because they couldn't be identified as a whole body, as a whole person. And when it came time, when the decision was made finally to lay these poor souls to rest, surely, and I please apologize, I apologize to you for being so graphic, body parts were assembled and put together, and surely pieces of a black person were laid to rest with pieces of a Caucasian and a Hispanic. That fact and its occurrence, the way that it occurred, the kind of quiet and dignified way that it occurred, unleashed a whole new kind of avenue of exploration and way of thinking about what happened in Texas City. 1947, deep, not just in the heart of Texas, in the heart of the South, and how for a minute or two or three, racism, as people knew it then, ceased to exist. And the races came together in a way that they never wanted to, but that they surely did, and in a way that would forever change people. There's some evidence to indicate that the city was divided, and not unlike cities across America. Segregation still existed. There was no room for segregation at the Memorial Cemetery when people were laid to rest. It was a very literal and provocative and I suppose it could have been controversial, but it just simply wasn't. The people there deemed it to not be controversial, and they buried their dead together. They celebrated the memories of those people together. They mourned their losses together. Almost metaphorically speaking, we began reading story after story and talking to folks over and over again who had talked about how at the very instant after the disaster, many of them thought it was Judgment Day, that God had perhaps was seeking retribution or just calling people home. Along with that thought, what physically happened to a lot of people is that when the explosion occurred, people were singed. Their white skin was turned brown or black. They were coated with thick tar and oil. There was even a molasses factory in Texas City that exploded, coated people with molasses. Family members would encounter other family members and presume them to be a different race than what they had been. And that something unnerving, extraordinary, and humbling had occurred, that perhaps God had turned their own relatives into a different color. Someone who had been white had been turned into a black man, and vice versa. The buildings back then were filled with asbestos, and some black residents of Texas City were coated white with asbestos, and relatives tried to grapple with that. The confusion, the hysteria, the smoke, the fire, the not knowing. White residents who were affected physically that way were admitted to what were then called the colored wards of area hospitals, the segregated areas where African American residents were treated. And there they would stay for days and even weeks on end until some family members began to realize that there was a possibility that someone might think that their relative, in fact, was African American instead of white. And so amazing stories of people getting together and in a way, confronting things that had been codified and had existed, obviously in America for decades and decades and decades. And it changed people in profound, obvious physical ways, spiritual ways, right in their soul, and culminated again in that moment when people were laid to rest together. At that memorial service for those folks, it was a multi-denominational, multiracial event. Also, frankly, I think, unheard of in the South. You had Catholic priest, rabbi, Episcopalian, on, and to say their prayers and lay folks to rest. So even on another level, to me, the story was extraordinary, that act, and just the courage almost the unspoken communal decision that that's the way it should be. This disaster was too profound for us to continue to be separated, and it caused people to get together in ways that they never thought. If you don't mind, so I'll cease babbling in my meandering way. I'll just read something again real quickly. Let me, since I just talked about that event, let me skip ahead, I guess, to the day that the city decided to bury its unidentified dead. Finally, a 2-acre plot of land is found 1.5 miles to the north of the city limits in a pasture where thin strands of grass bend in the wind and the soil is less spongy. It is a good distance from the waterfront, and if one stands in the center of that piece of earth, the docks and piers would seem to be 1,000 miles away. It is peaceful. Only a curving lane passes alongside it, and it feels like a place where solitude will be permanent. Doremus, who's an Episcopalian leader in the community, calls several clergymen and asks them to participate in the dedication of the new Texas City Memorial Cemetery on the 3rd Sunday of June. A rabbi from Galveston will be there. And Doremus, still shaken from being denied land to bury black people, makes sure to invite Reverend F.M. Johnson, the leading black minister in Texas City. With the land finally secured, preparations are made to receive the dead. Up until 3 days ago, there have still been frantic efforts to identify the remains in Camp Wallace. FBI fingerprint experts pored over any clues one last time. But now time is up. Beginning Saturday at 8 p.m., a 10-man crew at Camp Wallace had begun preparing the remains. After they are removed from the refrigerated coolers, the remains of each of the 63 unidentified are wrapped in a wide burial cloth. A piece of white ducking holds the cloth intact, and with a crayon, the number assigned to the nameless dead is written on the ducking. The bundles are lowered into identical silk-lined cypress coffins. None of the bodies is intact. None fills the 6'3" long caskets. Each casket has a number on it, the same kinds of numbers that have been put on those police traffic tags and affixed to the bodies in the Texas City High School gym. The Camp Wallace crew works through the night. In the morning, a Houston mortician has arrived with 51 hearses. Funeral homes around Texas have donated sprays of flowers. The caskets are loaded onto the hearses, and the 2-mile-long caravan begins its long trip to the north side of Texas City at 8:45 on Sunday morning, June 22nd. The immensity of the moment is incalculable. Some will say nothing remotely like it has ever occurred in the southern half of the United States. A mass burial for blacks and whites who had lived in the most thoroughly segregated way as possible. Unspoken is the pervasive belief that limbs and organs from several different people have somehow been placed together in some of the caskets. The black and white and Hispanic residents of Texas City are literally being buried together, and now the 63 nameless are being sent to their final reward. After weeks of waiting in refrigerated, sterile limbo, and they are being dispatched under the mutual guidance of an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a white Baptist, a black Baptist, a Jew, and a Catholic. It is muggy, the heat is seemingly swaying along the ground, moving hot and moist among the crowd. Elderly women in veils are being held under the arm, and their children are flipping paper fans in front of their sweating faces. The clouds look leaden, about to burst. A lone airplane is arcing overhead. The waterfront is far to the west, but there is such a stillness that it seems as if there is a ship's sea horn sounding from Galveston Bay. A preacher moves through the crowd, pressing a copy of the New Testament into every hand. Thousands of copies had just arrived from some businessmen in Philadelphia. Mayor Curtis Trahan has come, and he takes his place alongside the other 2,000 mourners. It may be that everyone who has not permanently fled from Texas City and is healthy enough to venture from a sickbed has assembled on the patches of toasted grass. The 7 clergymen take their places on a green felt-covered platform erected in front of a row of blood-red carnations. Alongside the platform, there's a spray of pink flowers shaped into a ship's anchor and placed there by some old sailors who had pooled what money they had left. There are small trucks at the edge of the soggy field waiting to move the damp black dirt across the simple caskets. Beginning with nameless dead number 243, each casket is carried by a 4-man honor guard of longshoremen, firemen, and World War II veterans. Black men, white men, and Hispanic men all reaching for the coffin handles. Curtis watches as the 63 caskets are placed over 6 huge trenches, ready to be lowered into the ground after the 45-minute ceremony. This is not the way he and Father Bill Roach had wanted segregation to end, but maybe Father Roach knew that this was the only way it could ever happen. The first to speak is Rabbi Louis Fagan from Galveston, his prayers crackling out from the speakers placed on top of the sound trucks. Each of the 7 clergymen reads a short holy passage. Reverend F.M. Johnson, the Negro preacher, stares out over his first impromptu congregation of white, brown, and black mourners. He had wrestled all night with his choice, trying to find something that would suggest there were painful lessons in the Texas City disaster. He had finally decided to read the 90th Psalm. Some people might be bound to hate him, bound to hate the black man's selection, because it suggests Texas City was being punished by a vengeful God. Thou carriest them away as with a flood. They are as asleep. In the morning they are like grass which groweth up. We are consumed by thine anger, and by thy wrath are we troubled. Thou hast set our iniquities before thee, our secret sins in the light of thy countenance. Who knoweth the power of thine anger? So teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Finally, Frank Doremus steps to the microphone. He reads from the Book of Common Prayer, and then he recites the Lord's Prayer. When he finishes, the entire crowd murmurs a response, Our Father, who art in heaven. The voices of the 2,000 mourners sound, someone says, like the insistent, aching roll of the surf along the Gulf of Mexico. Doremus nods to the casket bearers, and using ropes, they lower the coffins into the shallow trenches. An old man and his son are sinking to their knees alongside one trench, clasping their hands, closing their eyes, and heaving with tears. A middle-aged black woman, her face puffy with grief, is stepping forward and clutching a handful of wilted white oleander blossoms. She stands over one particular casket, slowly releases the blossoms, and watches as each curling flower petal flutters down. The tractor drivers and dirt movers watch from the edge of the ceremony. One by one, they flick their cigarettes into the field and start their engines. Each of the trenches will be covered. 63 small granite stones will be placed in neat rows over the graves. There is nothing on the stones other than the number each of these remains has been assigned. The numbers run randomly from 152 to 404. If anybody has any questions or thoughts about Texas City, I'd be glad to. Hey. Sure.
I haven't read the book, and for people who are not
Sure.
familiar with the story, you left us, we were on the dock with
Sure.
a freighter with
Sure.
ammonium nitrate in it on fire. What made it this catastrophe
Sure, yeah. Well,
that it, took the whole city?
spoken like a good editor. In essence, a ship blew up in Texas City. It was an ocean-going freighter. It was called the Grand Camp. It was a Liberty ship that had once served the United States kind of as a pickup truck of the ocean during World War II. It crisscrossed the oceans delivering troops and supplies to aid the war effort. It was a Liberty ship, and it was a great vessel if you're into maritime history. It was a real sturdy vessel that helped us win the war. After the war, these kinds of ships were decommissioned, put in mothballs all around the country. To begin the effort to win the Cold War, we decided, the United States did, to give some of these ships to our allies, including, in this instance, to France. France was going to employ the ship to come to the United States to get something else from us, that being ammonium nitrate, to help seed those fields in Europe. And that's where the disaster really began coalescing in earnest with the orders in aid of our military and White House officials. Arrangements were made for thousands and thousands of 100-pound bags of ammonium nitrate to be loaded onto the Grand Camp in Texas City and then be sent overseas. There's actually, kind of like life itself, There's always an eternal mystery at the core. There's a great deal of debate as to exactly what sparked the disaster, the physics of it. What exactly caused the explosion? And there's a lot of debate. Some people say it was the simple act of someone smoking a cigarette and throwing it onto a bag. Some people have suggested that these bags, in fact, were even delivered to Texas City already on fire, and that it took a unique set of circumstances to really fan those flames. There are some people who even suggest that ammonium nitrate, being so brilliant and devious in a brilliant way, that it spontaneously combusted and took on a life of its own. My faithful, great researcher, Mike, had, I think, I'd say the good fortune and maybe the honor of talking to one of the sailors who was a longshoreman, who was at ground zero, to use that term. And the way he described the flames that he was seeing coming up from the belly of the ship in the lower holds, it really seemed alive. You've heard that. It's an old song. The fire seemed alive. Sailors and longshoremen were aware that there was something on fire in the belly of the ship below deck in hold number 4, and they began clambering down. Puffs of smoke were coming out. They took down a water jug, a simple little water jug, and doused the little flame way over on the other side of the ship. That flame reappeared, same size, same eerie color. Went over there, we poured water on it. It went out and then popped up over here, and it seemed to be alive. That longshoreman, being also a veteran of a lot of danger and adventure during World War II, and also being very intuitive, knew that something bad, something really, really bad was about to happen, and he got the hell out of there and basically ran away as fast as he could. And then came back, like a lot of people, to help people after the disaster. The ship blew up, and it set in motion a series of other disasters. The ship disintegrated. It was obliterated. The anchor, the multi-ton anchor, went sailing for 1.5 miles through the sky. Pieces of the deck, went flying everywhere. Windows were rattled 100 miles away. People dropped to their knees in Galveston. In Denver, Colorado, which is a far piece from Texas City, a geologist was walking by his graphs and his seismographs and taking a casual look at his graphs at the exact moment the disaster occurred, and his graph began lurching in an extremely agitated fashion. He ran some quick calculations, estimations, trying to figure out where it was coming from, and his knowledge of science suggested that something bad, really bad, was happening in Texas, maybe in southeast Texas, maybe even an atomic bomb. The first suggestion from a lot of observers was that an atomic bomb had been dropped. There was something tantamount to a mushroom cloud that enveloped the whole city. The finest war correspondents of the day, people who had survived and reported admirably and bravely in World War II, were dispatched to the area by the New York Times, by the Associated Press. And what they did when they reported back to their superiors was that this, one AP reporter literally said this was a greater scene of devastation than what I saw in Japan after the atomic bomb was dropped there. It looked that bad. It had no formal recognition, at least along the waterfront, to anything that anybody could remember. So I hope I answered your question. It was a very good question. I should have started with an answer. Oh, absolutely, a chain reaction. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just about to get to that before I veered off again. It set in motion fires, other secondary explosions. Another freighter packed with ammonium nitrate, essentially, a day later, blew up. It was a greater explosion than that initial explosion. A smaller loss of life. So many people had been killed, there were fewer people to kill. Again, to be so graphic, people had fled. The second explosion was in fact greater. Refineries burst open one after another, and imagine the fear of people who really had lost the ability to escape, to get away. Communication was down. Another point of convergence. That day, and in fact in the weeks building to that day, and then that day, there was a phone strike. People couldn't use the phone. They couldn't call each other. The phone lines that were working were not manned initially. Another convergence. So yes, I'm sorry, there were enormous fires that welled up for days on end. It brought in fire departments from around Texas, even around the country, relief efforts from around the country, triage units. President Truman ordered that the hero, the World War II hero of the Bataan Death March, General Jonathan Wainwright, be dispatched with the Fourth Army to occupy the town and essentially cordon it off and retain control. It was a massive, massive relief effort in response to a massive, a set of conflagrations, fires, awful moments. So yeah. Johnny.
Okay. I'll put you on the spot. Speaking as a reporter and as a researcher, what was, and I haven't gotten to the end of the book yet, as far as who your primary sources were, who was still alive.
Sure.
Tell us about your breakthrough interviews, the archival material that really kind of shone the way to the rest of the material.
Sure,
When the story really came together, when you had that aha moment as a journalist.
Yeah. Probably the best answer is taking a look, and it's sounds like insider baseball, but it was really studying what other people had written at that time, the real nitty-gritty, on-the-ground, correspondence, whether it be radio, which is your area of expertise, John, or the news dispatches that they were filing, written versions that they were then, having copy boys race up to the newspapers in Houston and elsewhere. Those firsthand accounts, I think, formed the framework. What I think we decided was important, my research team and I decided, was to really also go a little bit off the meter and take a look at what some people might consider non-mainstream journalism. We found an enormously rich repository of material in the African-American newspapers of the day that told an incredibly rich story that I think hadn't been widely told about the impact primarily in the African-American community in Texas City, and that blossomed and led to a lot of questions and thoughts and added dimension to the story. That was I guess the Nirvana aha experience in some way, and a pleasant one, because it led us to meet people that we hadn't known about. The interesting thing about the Texas City story, this kind of cliche slogan these days, 6 degrees of separation. It's interesting to me, living in Texas now for quite a while, that if you work at it a little bit, during the course of any day, you'll find someone, through dint of conversation and even happenstance, a convergence yet again, you'll find someone who's got a connection to Texas City. It happened the instant I walked in the door here this evening and met someone affiliated with this great bookstore who said, by the way, my dad was a doctor and my mom was a nurse. They were in Houston, and they stared right into the face of the tragedy in their way, because suddenly they were doing incredible work to save people that were being rushed up to Houston to be treated. So I had only walked in the door within 5 seconds and had encountered another connection. So I guess in a lot of ways we're an accumulation of aha moments, and I'm not sure I answered that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question on the ship.
I'm really excited about the possibility of reading this book.
Great.
As I was listening to your talking, I was wondering, can you describe the layout of the town
Sure.
in comparison to where the ship was?
Sure.
Describe like how close the school was
Sure.
that was overcrowded,
Yeah.
the hospitals, that
Sure.
sort of thing, and
Sure.
how the explosion affected the surrounding area.
Yeah. What's 1947, things, less was known about the dangers of the kinds of things that we can create. And, whether it be from an environmental perspective or even just a pure explosive capacity, we just didn't know as much as we do today. I'm stating the obvious. So, ringing the waterfront of Texas City, it's a town that's in between. For those who don't know, it's in between Galveston and Houston. You might know it as a place that you kind of pass by if you haven't been there and turn off the highway, the Gulf Freeway that stretches from Houston to Galveston. You kind of have to work a little bit to get to it. You have to turn left as you're heading south and get to it. And if you go as far as you can go, after you kind of turn east, you'll come to the Texas City waterfront, and it's really an extraordinary thing to see. It's just ringed by miles of refineries and petrochemical plants. There are more today than there were then, but in essence, that kind of layout existed. So what you have as sort of a point of contact, if you sailed into Texas City, like the sailors who were on this doomed ship, the Grand Comte, what you'd see first were the refineries and the chemical plants. There was Monsanto. It was probably the biggest presence in the corporation that was affected the most in terms of loss of life and commercial property. That's sort of the baseline of Texas City. It's the reason maybe it's there, is this petrochemical and refinery area. And the reason I mentioned that we've learned a lot in this day and age. Back here in 1947, there were folks who lived way too close to their, a lot of it was flattened out, kind of empty field that was crisscrossed by oyster shell paved roads. They would dredge up oyster shells and kind of hammer them down, and you'd have this sort of bleached bone white oyster shell network of roads, some of them almost informal roads. You have the refineries, this sort of little patchwork of roads, and then homes. If I had to say it, 10 blocks away, an average city block of 10 blocks away, there was the beginning of the residential community, and primarily as a point of contact again. The Hispanic community and the Black community were a little bit closer. And then there was, in earnest, the crossing Texas Avenue, one of the major arteries in the town. You would find the beginning of the white community, for lack of a better term. So, all in all, homes way too close in final estimation and final study. Almost everyone agrees that homes were placed too close to the waterfront. Schools, City Hall, all the kind of anchor points of a community, way too close, 10, 20, 30 blocks away. That might actually seem like a great distance, and it wasn't for an explosion this powerful. So they were sprinkled all around. Boomtown, again, not a wealth of medical facilities, certainly nothing on par to handle this. And I think, one of the final proofs of that, I mentioned this earlier in some of this stuff, when I read it probably sounded out of context, but I mentioned the Texas City high school gymnasium and the fact that it was turned into a morgue. There were so many bodies so quickly in a small town, they didn't know what to do. And they decided quickly, collectively, frankly, almost, miraculously, calmly, to turn the Texas City High School gymnasium into a temporary morgue, housing dozens and dozens of bodies, remains. Some incredible, imagery from there as it was relayed to us. it was springtime and people were preparing for the prom. Kids were going to graduate and getting ready for the senior prom, and decorations and movement was afoot to turn the high school gym, old hardwood floor, those old style windows with kind of the kind of metal meshing in the window, and then obviously the plans for the prom were put aside, and the whole gymnasium is filled with bodies. There's an amazing photograph that really says it better than me. You see some weak light filtering in from outside, and you can tell that it's cutting through probably some haze left by a fire, by something awful, and it cuts through the upper reaches of the high school gym window, and then if your eye trails down, then you see the basketball hoop, and it looks maybe innocence reclaimed. It's basketball, and if your eye goes to the bottom of the frame of the photograph, you see neatly arranged body after body covered with gray military issue blankets that were brought by the Fourth Army and covering these remains. And then in the background, you'll see children. Teenagers walking around trying to identify their parents, sisters, brothers, so forth. So I veered again. I hope at the early part of my answer I answered your question. Yeah, everything was too close. I'm sorry.
Got a couple of questions.
I was always under the understanding that the ship that blew up was actually trying to get into the Galveston docks.
Yeah.
Is this true?
It was destined to go to Galveston on its way out of Texas City. There was a sense that it could go there and pick up some more supplies. One thing that's still a matter of debate, to answer your question real quickly. What is clear, what's certainly known, what happened was that it was docked in Houston prior to coming to Texas City. What didn't happen in Houston was it being loaded with ammonium nitrate. For whatever reason, and I tried to investigate this, port officials there deemed ammonium nitrate to be a substance that they didn't want on their dock. And again, for whatever reasons, it was deemed that Texas City would handle it, and so it sailed down Galveston Bay and docked in Texas City. You mentioned, again, it's almost a convergence, and if not for fate, circumstance, poetry, whatever, God's hand, none of this would have happened. The crew was French crew, which had been sent to America to reclaim this vessel, and then to pick up goods in America and bring it back to France to help essentially really feed their own children, was really en route back home before it was ordered at the last minute to go to Texas City. The guys on the vessel were writing letters that day, that morning, and the evening before the explosion, writing the letters that would be their last letters to their family. And they were writing that they were looking forward to coming home after being away, like old salts, for months on end at sea, and they were finally going to come home. So there's a lot of mystery about that vessel, even going back to the thought that perhaps somewhere in the lower hold that there might have been a fire and that it came into port already on fire in some way. So,
Second question: that of the majority of the people that were killed wasn't from the initial explosion of the ship, but rather than when Monsanto Chemical blew up.
Yeah. You'll look, if you wanted to look at it as a percentage. That's exactly right. Yeah. People were killed in many ways. They were just simply knocked dead by the blast. I mean, literally knocked dead. People were set on fire. I mean, in almost any way imaginable. And Monsanto, again, had the great unfortune of being almost at the epicenter. Imagine there being a really potent and very active, major, and important, really, I suppose you'd say, a productive chemical plant right across the street from the World Trade Center. or at the base of the World Trade Center in the lobby area, if you will. That's almost what happened. You could almost argue a similarity that it was just too close. It was dozens of yards away, a very short distance from where the ship blew up, and the people who were at work there, were decimated. Yeah, it's a good question.
Was this Monsanto Chemicals docks, though, also?
Well, they had an understanding. It was actually the docks there, as they are today, are owned by kind of a quasi private public entity, the Texas City Terminal Railway Corporation, and they worked in conjunction with Monsanto. They were certainly friends, though they weren't exactly, it wasn't exactly at the Monsanto dock.
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Over behind you.
Both my parents grew up in Texas City, and I've met several people who are probably the same. Some people who were alive then, were children then when it happened. And so all of my life I've, heard the stories from my parents. My mother lost both of her parents. Her father was the postmaster, in fact. But what I remember always hearing was that the huge loss of life were the spectators who came to watch.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm almost afraid to ask this question, but because I don't know if it's an urban myth but there was always this hint or underlying, hint that there were ammunitions, guns on the ship, and that there were some sort of purchase between another country and the United States.
Sure, yeah.
And I just wondered in your research if you found that to be true.
You're right. It wasn't a myth.
Okay.
There was ammunition on board the Grand Camp, small arms ammunition. What it was doing there and why it was en route back to France. There's a greater debate about that, but it's indicated in a lot of the manifests and inventories that did survive the disaster. So it was there. Okay. What it did in terms of its contribution, that's also another mystery. I mean, people have debated it wasn't an accelerator. Not to go in any great detail, but you don't just get ammonium nitrate and wreak havoc. There has to be something that accompanies it, and there's a sense that didn't help. I mean, having ammunition on board. But the greater sense is that fact, it's not an urban myth, that fact that there was ammunition on board didn't spark it, but again, it didn't help.
But it was always an issue that seemed like no one wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of things about the Texas City disaster. And again, I'm hopelessly biased, so please forgive me, but I think it's the subtitle, I'm just noticing, says The Forgotten Disaster, and I've thought so long and hard, about that. Why is it? And there are many, 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 many things that were laid to rest. And again, I think a good portion of it had to do with the fact that folks there, again, they work. They don't draw attention. They rebuild. The city symbol, down there is the phoenix. It's on different flags and city emblems, and it's about, rising up, rebuilding, the rising, if you will, and so, when you have that kind of environment and spirit, I think a lot of the stories either disappear or kept quiet and then go away.
I can see when you mentioned earlier about not knowing or falling into this pit of not
Right.
knowing when to stop.
Sure.
Because of all of the people who were, everyone was affected.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
knew someone who was killed or
Yeah.
hurt, so I can see how it would be hard to stop
Yeah.
with the human interest part of it.
I was in
But-
to interrupt. I was in Houston on Friday and met an old colleague of mine, journalist pal. I'm guessing I guess she's in her early 60s, mid 60s, and I sat next to her for years, and we'd go to lunch, and I knew her, and she was a friend, and lo and behold, she told me that she was in Danforth Elementary School, which is the incredibly decimated and devastated elementary school where children fled for their lives, and some fell to their knees praying to Jesus because they thought it was Judgment Day as well, and she was one of them. And one of those children who had survived. And it's, you know, yeah, and I think, you know, again, probably human nature at some ultimate level to not talk about those things too much.
I want to thank you, really, because my brother is here, and we have always wondered why hasn't no one ever told this story, because it was huge. I mean, it was just huge and affected so many people. And
Sure.
I mean, even, you know, my generation,
sure, yeah.
I wasn't even born yet, but it's still such a huge factor in our family's life. So I really appreciate your doing this.
Was you mentioned your mom, was she injured? Did she?
No, her sister was.
I ask a curious question. Did she lose her hearing?
No,
Okay.
but she remembers the school crumbling around her and people trying to get out, people being hurt trying
Sure.
to get out. But a fascinating memory of hers was when she got outside, she didn't know where she was.
Right. Yeah.
You know, all the houses were gone.
Yeah, all the points of reference were gone.
Yeah.
Stood upside down, yeah.
So that was just, you know,
sure.
very fascinating. And then trying to find her way home,
Yeah.
you know.
That simple act, yeah.
Yeah. So, but thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that story, too.
I grew up in Texas City
you go.
and was 4 years old when the explosion happened.
There you were, yeah.
I'm short.
Oh, it's okay. I could hear you, yeah.
And why so many people were killed is there was no security. And they were all down there,
Yeah.
500 to 600, watching the fire
Yeah.
with their
You're
children
right.
and strollers and
Right.
families.
Yeah. It's, why do you, if I may ask you a question, why wasn't there security?
They didn't have it.
Yeah. And I think,
They-
I mean, that's really the conclusion I came to today. It seems like such an obvious. We've got security at the shopping mall. There wasn't security at the major plants. There was a whole other, rabbit hole that I mentioned earlier. And I really almost fell down, and my family was going to have to, file a missing persons report because I was bound and never come back.
To the plants, you had to have a
Yeah.
badge and security.
Sure, yeah.
But there was no security
Yeah.
at the waterfront. And the schools and the downtown was really probably closer
Sure.
than, Danforth probably wasn't half a mile.
Yeah.
Elementary.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It was very, very
Yeah,
close.
sure.
And so,
Too
and
close.
downtown was just
Yeah.
within a mile.
Yeah. What you're saying is great because it allows me to meander for a second again, if you'd indulge me. One of the things that I tried to write about and that I thought I would write about endlessly was the fact that at this time period in America, 1947, we had great faith in the men in the white lab coats. They were considered wizards, and we were going to address polio, we were going to address cancer, we had won the Great War. There was a great sense of this sort of chinny brio, this muscular sense that America can do everything and take care of problems. In conjunction with that, there was just great faith in what the scientists were doing. Scientists, a lot of folks, believed had won World War II. It wasn't the G.I. Joe in the trenches, that it was actually the men in the white lab coats in their various projects around the country had harnessed nature's forces, atomic energy, and created the weapons that we needed to close the chapter in World War II. So, you leave that episode of time, that historical context, again, that great kind of geopolitical bit of history, that great sense of history and technology, and then you begin to see how it began to trickle down to Texas City. Such great faith suggests that maybe you don't need security. What could go wrong? The folks who work there can corral it. They'll know what to do with it. We have faith in them. They helped to win the war. This was an accident. It wasn't intentionally, engendered. but there remain a lot of questions about why it happened. And again, as you so correctly pointed out, why folks could just literally walk with children within yards of a ship that's filled with the most deadly explosive imaginable and that was about to blow up. So, I'm sorry, I gave another speech.
I think people were too trusting.
Yeah.
And it never occurred to you because even I
course.
was born and raised here, and I was 9.5, and I remember it clearly.
Remember it, yeah.
We felt the earth,
Here in Austin.
the rumbling and the
Yeah,
shake.
you felt the earth rumble in Austin.
And
yeah.
the school kids, we were given hours off of class, and we would spend hours in our classroom
Sure.
with little boxes filling toilet articles
Right.
and
Right.
stuff like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
for the school kids left in Texas
Yeah.
City. And it became known as the Texas school kids disaster too.
Right.
For the school kids.
Yeah. That's
It was very real.
Yeah. I
But
wish I had
think
known
it
that.
never occurred to us
yeah.
to worry about, because you could hear even if there was a big fire.
Sure.
Everybody went.
Yeah.
It was like entertainment.
Yeah,
So to speak.
Great word. I mean, trust. There was just great trust. One of the wonderful things my research team did for me, I asked them, help me understand the mood of the nation. Let's take a look at a little bit of the historical context. There are some great writers out there of narrative nonfiction. David Marinis at the Washington Post is brilliant at doing this, at drawing kind of a historical backdrop, the big picture, what's going on in the big picture set against the kind of the more narrowly focused story. And what I wanted to know was what was going on in the big picture. So let's look at some national publications. Let's talk to some historians. What was the mood of folks at the time? My researcher, Mike Smith, came back to me one day with a number of ads that he had pulled down from various publications at the time. And you can learn a lot about where you are in a moment in history and geography, I suppose, just by looking at advertising. You learn volumes. And what I learned from looking at what Mike brought to the table was that there was wild faith, wild trust in chemistry and science. There were ads at that time, in 1947, advocating the beneficial uses of asbestos, and to the point of almost suggesting that ingesting it was beneficial. There were ads, and we laugh at this now, that, and you probably have seen these or recall them or know about them, that suggested that, using tobacco, smoking cigarettes wasn't just enjoyable, it was truly medically beneficial. That if you smoked it, it would make you more healthy than you were before, healthier than your neighbor. Smoke more, and so and we know differently now. But looking at those ads, and it's not we just know more now, and it's not to suggest that how could they have not? People just didn't know. We just didn't know. So
Weren't educated.
No, there was a trust. There was a faith.
Here
yeah.
in Texas,
Yeah.
we were still, even though we had participated in the war,
Sure.
we were still pretty much isolated. I mean, it was a huge state.
Right.
It took 4 hours to drive from here to San Antonio on a little 2-lane
Right, sure,
highway.
yeah, right.
So
Yeah.
you can imagine people didn't just get in a plane and fly,
Right,
or
yeah.
you didn't have TV.
Sure.
You depended on the
Yeah.
radio and
Yeah.
word of mouth.
Yep, exactly.
And,
Yeah.
So you just simply
Yeah.
were ignorant.
You're right. Yeah.
But
Thank you.
Bill, thanks for doing this. I grew up in Texas City
There
and
you go. Okay.
was not born when this happened, but obviously throughout my entire childhood. The interesting thing about a couple of things people have mentioned today, when you talk about the forgotten,
Yeah.
I promise that was the case. We rarely.
Really? Yeah.
There were annual, of course, observances. There was nothing of a large scale significant observances. In fact, the Memorial Park that you referenced out on Loop 197
Right.
was in very, very bad disarray until about 15, maybe
Right.
20 years ago, when it was done right.
I got to interrupt you because, and perpetually curious, but why? I mean, why did people?
I honestly believe that the reason is because it's a petrochemical city,
Right.
and people wanted to not wanted to forget that happened, because that was the livelihood for 85-90% of the town. And you know, all through school, I worked in those refineries, and the last thing I wanted to do was to think about what could happen. And so,
was it out of fear of, something punitive happening out of the workplace, or just because it seemed like you cast aspersion on the place where you were proud to work and it was your livelihood?
No, I think it was more of let's don't think about that. Okay. Let's don't think that could happen again. Yeah. And it was more of a out of sight, out of mind that was then. But even, you know, the town was 15,000 then. It got up to about 40,000 in the late 60s, early 70s, where it has remained. Right. But as population-wise, it's remained about that, because people are moving farther out and coming back into work. But at any rate, by way of reference, the lady asked about the location. Picture Lamar Boulevard here being 9th Avenue, which is the main artery going into town. And the plants being downtown Austin, that's how close it is, and or how close it was.
That's very good.
And at any rate, I really appreciate you doing this. There have been, of course, historical references before. Absolutely. One was more of a pictorial book.
Sure, there's a good photo.
But I'm embarrassed to say, truthfully, this probably says it best. I lived there for whatever 20-something years as a kid, and I will probably get more out of this book. I probably know as much about it that would fit in a thimble compared to what you found out.
Thanks, that's nice.
My dad went to high school at Kerwin and Galveston, of course, with all the windows breaking and all that happened. But at any rate, I really appreciate you doing this.
Sounds like it's in your roots there, You know, I did, to interrupt you, and I'm sorry to head you off to something that you said made me think of an important part of what happened in Texas City. There was another form of courage that emerged over time, the sense that it was okay to question your elected officials. I mean, really, turn the Wayback Machine to 1947. Really isn't too long ago. You know, we're so accustomed now to registering our complaints in court, on the airwaves, in letters, through emails now, what have you, in protest. Not a lot of that was done, in 1947. What people in Texas City, slowly came to think very, very quietly and in a really frustrating, painful, bittersweet way as they sought answers, not compensation or relief or monetary reward. They just wanted answers, some form of resolution, and they began coming very quietly but collectively to the sense that somebody in charge had let this happen, that elected officials, somebody who lived above the cloud line, who probably didn't live in Texas City, had set in motion something that caused this to happen, that somebody was negligent. And over time, that sense, that frustration, the lack of answers really welled up. And what people hear, these are veterans, these are patriots, these are quiet, ordinary, Americans. And I use patriot in a good, lowercase d, democratic, way. These were folks who were just honest, hard-working people. And it hadn't ever occurred to them before to lodge protests, to frankly question the people that they had voted for and put in office. And then they began doing just that. And it took a form of individual courage and then collective courage to begin re-examining maybe what they thought were some of the root causes of this, those big forces. They wanted to climb up the ladder and look above the cloud line and see if they could identify some folks, some people that had something to do with this. And maybe even, yes, at the end of the day, were negligent, that were responsible for death and destruction in Texas City. It took an amazing amount of courage. Consider the historical context. 2 years after World War II, you're a World War II veteran, or you've worked in a defense plant, and you've laid down your life for your country, and now you're coming to an awful realization alone, and then very quietly with your neighbors, that an elected official, maybe somebody you had voted for and put in office in our democracy, had done wrong by you. In 1947, after we had won the Great War, after they were in the middle of this great sense of patriotism, and the sense even that living in Texas City was the greatest place on earth, because now you were going to help win the second war, and you were going to feed people, and you were going to keep them away from the sway of communism. So people began questioning, and ultimately what resulted is something that's in the latter portion of my book. It might strike some people as some sort of strange interruption in the story. But it's really the concluding and really ultimately giant bittersweet phase of the story. Texas City and the people who live there began entering into the courtroom. And what they began doing for one of the first times in American history, and this is so, I think, courageous and important, they began suggesting that a legal doctrine that had existed in the United States since our founding, that the king can do no wrong, i.e., officials at the highest level of government can really do no wrong. They can't be held accountable through a civil action in the way that we could hold our neighbors accountable, that in fact the king can do wrong, that in fact as much as we like to believe that our leaders have our best interests at heart and know what they're doing, that at times they've been negligent in their duties to us. In the context of American history, in the context of where they are in Texas City, it's an amazing form of bravery. Collectively, they coalesced around a class action lawsuit. It centered around a widow from Galveston who had lost her husband in the Texas City disaster. It went to federal court in Houston, where they actually won, where the federal judge ruled that folks there had been harmed by the federal government. It was rejected at the appeals court in New Orleans. It went up to the Supreme Court, ultimately rejected there. And after many, many years, the government very, 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 very quietly did something through legislation to indicate that, yes, we did wrong by the people in Texas City. Another interesting display of courage in that community. I'm getting an indication that I need to shave or that I better leave. So thank you very much for having me, and I'd be glad to stay if I'm allowed to. Thank you.
Bill Minutaglio is also author of First Son, George W. Bush and the Bush Family Dynasty. City on Fire, the forgotten disaster that devastated a town and ignited a landmark legal battle, is published by HarperCollins, on the web at harpercollins.com.